on the next slide around, I guess that when we talk about diversity, a lot of the time what we talk about is that whole piece is about recognizing and kind of including people from like a range of different social groups or backgrounds or different kinds of characteristics. Um, for me, as I was brainstorming, I was thinking about different gender differences in terms of gender, in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of age, race, ethnicity, or national origin, and how all those can kind of configure differently, in terms of ability or disability, socioeconomic class, religion, body size and fatness, also, and like loads of other ones. Um, and I think it's really useful sometimes when we think about diversity to think about like all of the different ways that we are all different from each other. And that a lot of this also will be very kind of culturally specific. So like different cultures and different societies all around the world have like really different ideas about all of these things, about gender, about age, about race. And so the ways that we might be, that each of us might be maybe part of a minority group in one culture might be different, yeah, in a different culture as well. Um, and I think sometimes, for me anyway, when I look at the whole range of ways in which we can all be different to each other, like this list is just a small part of it. That sometimes we talk about diversity as it relates to sort of minority groups or like marginalized groups, when in reality, I think most of us belong to at least one of these groups in at least one of these ways. And maybe differently, again, in different cultures or different countries, and you might experience yourself differently in different places. But I think a lot of us belong to at least one of these groups. And again, differently over our lifetimes. Age is a great example, that we all started out life as babies and as children, and children have very different experiences of being included than adults. And then hopefully, we all hope to grow up and to be elderly. And so we will all hopefully have that experience of that particular type of minority group or that particular type of marginalization, as well as any others that we might experience too. So I think it's really useful when we think about diversity to think about the kind of broad tapestry of ways in which we're all different to each other, but then that's also kind of quite culturally specific too, and that will figure differently in different spaces. Um, and then kind of a lot of the time when we talk about diversity, we also talk about this idea of inclusion. So how can we include people, based on all of those different characteristics, all of the differences between us, and how can we um, think, I guess, about how we think about that difference in whatever culture or whatever society that we're in. And a lot of that is kind of contained within the idea of like social norms and kind of biases. And so this idea sometimes that um, there's a sort of a norm, there's a kind of a standard way of being or a standard type of person in like a given society. So for example, in like Western Europe, which is the context that I'm in, the kind of norm is that people are like heterosexual, that they're white, that they're middle class, that they're able bodied, maybe that they're male rather than female. There's this kind of idea of like that is what the sort of standard quote unquote normal person is, even though like very few of us are that person. And that person, that list is really only just one type of person. And the vast majority of the whole of our society doesn't fit into that specific box. But still, sometimes we think about that as if it is the norm, as if it's kind of the normal thing, that everybody else is sort of differentiated against that. Um, as opposed to just being like one kind of way of being or one type of person. And so it's really useful, I think, for us to be able to identify those norms and identify the ways that impacts on how we think, um, the ways that those norms function in society, in other people, and in ourselves, in terms of the kind of ways that we think about ourselves, the way that we think about others, and the ways that we think about like others that we know in our life, but then others kind of on a wider scale on a social level, and the assumptions that we might make as well. And it does limit us, I think, sometimes in the ways that we can think about ourselves and what we can imagine for ourselves and for our futures when we're existing within this kind of idea of adhering almost to a sort of a social kind of norm. And then that there's work that goes in with that. So when you become aware of how all this works within our society and you start to see it and you start to identify it in other people and in yourself, that then there's a work that happens there to to try to counteract that and to try to include people from marginalized groups and that kind of term, and to try and include more diverse people in your work, maybe in your like social circles, in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of your allyship, all of that sort of piece can be real work. And we're going to look at in the session today what that looks like for specifically in relation to the LGBTQ plus community. So when we talk about the LGBTQ plus community, what we're talking about is two distinct but related kind of ideas or concepts, which are gender and sexuality. And when we talk about gender, we tend to often talk about it as like an individual piece, so that each individual person in the world has a gender, um, and but it also functions as a kind of wider sort of social, political, and cultural force. So we need to understand the two ways that gender functions. We'll look at this in a little bit more detail on the next slide, but in terms of our individual experiences of gender, those are often kind of made up of a whole range of different pieces. So we have the biological sex of all of our bodies. You have your personal gender identity and like how you kind of personally experience your gender, your sex, whatever that looks like for you, and then how you express that also through masculinity or femininity. And then all that sits within the sort of wider kind of macro social, cultural, and political space of gender. And so, how gender functions on a wider level in our societies and in our cultures, in terms of all those kinds of norms, all the expectations and the kind of stereotypes, particularly around how men and women are, quote unquote, supposed to behave or to dress or to act, or what their roles are in the workplace or in the family or in society more broadly. And all of that will kind of impact on how we think about ourselves. So there's a sort of two-way flow between how we experience our own genders, how that contributes to the society that we live in and that we kind of grow up in, but then also how that society shapes how we think about ourselves too. So we're very social beings and we exist always in relation to other people. And then there's sexuality too. And so sexuality is around the attraction maybe that you might have to other people. And that might be romantic, it might be sexual, maybe both, it might be neither. And we often express sexuality in terms of the gender of the person that you are attracted to. So that's why we often talk about gender and sexuality, that they're very kind of related and connected. So understanding gender in a little bit more detail, I wanted to kind of take this slide to sort of talk through how we understand gender and how it kind of functions in all of our lives. Um, because I think it's really important, I think, to kind of to take it sort of from the ground up almost, and for us all as individuals to be able to reflect on our own sort of ideas or experiences or concepts around gender. So often, kind of when I talk about gender, I like to kind of chart it through a person's life in this way. So um, we all begin in the same way in this world at the moment of birth, or conception or whatever, but taken kind of from the moment of birth, that when children are born, the parents and the nurses and the midwives, the doctors, whoever's there, looks at the child at the moment of birth, and looks at loads of different things, including their health and any needs that they might have, but also looks at their biological sex at the moment of birth. And biological sex is made up of a whole bunch of different things, including the chromosomes, the X and Y chromosomes, the hormones that are present in the body, the reproductive organs, and the genitalia as well. And all of those things kind of come together to create the biological sex of all of our bodies. That biological sex is usually male or female. And that's very present at the moment of birth because all those people, the nurses, the midwives, the doctors, will look at the child and typically based on their external genitals at birth, makes an assumption that this child is a girl or this child is a boy. And then depending on where you are in the world and how that works, but that will be recorded on like your birth certificate, and kind of from that moment of birth, that gender is sort of what we would say is assigned to that young person or to that child. Obviously, before the child has a sense of themselves, has any sense of who they are, and whether that feels correct for them or not. But all of that assumption is based on their sort of their biology or their anatomy at birth, as an infant. And then the way that we raise children, the way that children grow up, and the way that children are socialized is very gendered in terms of the kinds of clothes that we give to girls and boys, the kinds of toys that we give to girls and boys, the kinds of schools that we might send them to. Particularly in Ireland, we're very fond of schools for girls versus schools for boys. The kinds of activities that they might be encouraged to do, the expectations that we might have of them are all really, really different for girls and for boys. And so the way that gender functions in all of our lives as children is really important in terms of how we come to understand ourselves as ourselves, but then also how we come to understand ourselves in relation to other people, in relation to our parents or our carers, or in relation to our peers or friends, and being able to understand that gender piece becomes really, really important for young people, for children in particular. I have a 5-year-old in my life, and she's nearly 6, and she is like so focused and so interested in like girl stuff versus boy stuff. Like she's like, girl stuff is, she loves pink, she loves unicorns, she loves princesses, like all of that stuff is so beautiful to her. She hates the boy things and she hates the boys, and like all of her friends are girls, and like that piece is really important for young people to be able to understand and kind of accurately express their gender in that way. And so we see that the development of gender expression from young people from a really early age, so from like 3, 4, 5, obviously then up into adulthood. Whereas any kind of uh, concept or expression of sexual orientation doesn't happen until like much later, and kind of coming into puberty. And so that kind of gender socialization, that kind of gender development piece happens from childhood all the way up through puberty, adolescence, into adulthood as well. And as that is happening, what is happening for each of us as individuals is that we are developing a sense of our own gender, and we're developing a sense of maybe gender identity, or the gender that you identify with. And that might be as a woman or as a man or as a different gender. And for the vast majority of people, the gender that you were assigned at birth, or like the biological sex of your body, gender that people assumed that you would be, turns out to be the gender that you identify with as you get older. We estimate that for 98 or maybe 99% of the population, the biological sex of your body is the same as the gender that you identify with. So when you were born, say, everybody was like, this child seems like a boy, we raised that child as a boy. You grow up, you're identifying as a boy, you identify as a man. There's no kind of mismatch between that. That all kind of makes sense and matches for you. And we might describe that person then as cisgender, on the right hand side of the screen. So cisgender is when your gender identity is the same as your biological sex. But for some people, the gender that they identify with can be different to the gender that they were assigned at birth, or the biological sex of their body. And we might describe those people then as transgender. So transgender describes is kind of an umbrella, and it describes a whole bunch of different ways of being or of expressing yourself. So you might have, for instance, a transgender man is someone who, when they were born, everybody looked at this child and said, this child seems like a girl. We raised this child as a girl. And then at some point, maybe as a child, maybe going through puberty, or maybe as an adult, that person came to identify more as a man and to express that in whatever way he expresses that. Um, and that can look really different for different people. Um, and then on the flip side, a trans woman is someone who, again, when they were born, everybody assumed that this was a boy, um, but came to identify as a woman and to express that whatever way. And I think sometimes there can be some confusion with how we use those terms. So just to be clear, I guess that the man and the woman part of those terms refers to the gender that the person identifies with, not the gender that they were like assigned at birth, or what we kind of guess they have going on, maybe biologically. And then also under the trans umbrella, we have non-binary. And non-binary is currently the most popular term for a whole range of ways of being or expressing yourself. Um, that sits anywhere outside of just male or just female. So there's people who describe themselves as non-binary who just don't identify with like any sense of a gender at all. Or you might say that you're non-binary, and if you have a gender that is maybe not male or female, but it is something else, whatever way they express that. Or you can have people who identify as non-binary because just sitting in one box doesn't feel like the most correct kind of option for them. So non-binary as a term can look really different for different people. Um, it's currently the most popular term for this space. There have been other terms that have been more popular in the past, like gender queer or maybe gender fluid. Lots of people still use that language. This is definitely the place where the language is kind of changing or evolving, I guess, the most. Um, I am non-binary and I use the term non-binary to describe myself, and I really like it because I really like that sort of sometimes that kind of vagueness and that it can be different things to different people. Um, and then there's gender expression and how we express all of that to the world. And we're constantly expressing ourselves through clothes, hair, makeup, accessories, behavior traits, ways of talking, ways of standing, of walking, whatever it is. And we're expressing loads of parts of ourselves when we do that. But a lot of the time we're expressing masculinity or femininity or a mixture of both. And again, that will be really culturally specific. So sitting within that kind of social and cultural piece is that the ways that we express ourselves look really different in different cultures, and the ways that we are expected to express ourselves are also really different in different cultures. So this would all be really culturally specific too. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about how this intersects or interacts with sexuality. And so when we talk about sexual orientation, again, as I said earlier, we're referring to the people that you're like romantically or sexually attracted to. And usually what we talk about is the gender of the person that you're sexually attracted to and you're attracted to. So being attracted to men, being attracted to women or other genders or whatever way you kind of express that. But often when we talk about sexuality and we talk about sexual orientation, what we do is that we talk about the two of them at the same time. So you talk about your gender and the gender of the people that you are attracted to. So, for instance, on the right hand side of the slide, like when we say heterosexual, like a heterosexual man, for instance, what you're saying there is that you are a man and you are attracted to women, or like straight man, I guess. For instance, when we use the term lesbian, what we're saying there is that the gender of the person is that they're a woman and that they are attracted to other women. So often we're talking about the two things at the same time. Similarly, for gay man as a man who's attracted to other men, and then bisexual or pansexual or a variety of other terms within there usually mean kind of that the person is attracted to all genders or that gender isn't the defining kind of characteristic of the people that they are attracted to. And so I think it's useful to be able to think about gender and sexuality as being that they are distinct things, that your gender is to do with like your sense of self and your sense of that part of your personality and that part of your expression. And then sexuality is what you are attracted to in another person, but then that they are also very related because you think about your gender and you think about the gender of the people that you're attracted to often at the same time. So they're both connected and they're different things. Um, and then for people who fit in within, I guess, the LGBTQ plus community, so for lesbians, gay people, bisexual people, trans and queer people, I wanted to do a little bit of an overview as to what the kind of context is for our communities, specifically in Europe, I guess, at the moment. And when I was doing this, I broke it down into kind of three different areas. So sort of our legal rights, or the legal rights that are most pertinent, I guess, for the LGBTQ plus community, our needs for access to healthcare, and then the kind of social inclusion and acceptance piece. So we're going to look at all of these in a little bit more detail. So in terms of our legal rights, and I guess I'm kind of situating this within the sort of human rights discourse, we, all of us, whether we're LGBTQ plus or not, often have the same needs for the same kinds of human rights, for dignity, for respect, for recognition, for equality, for non-discrimination, to live a life that is happy and free and healthy, under your own kind of steam or your own kind of power, I guess. Um, and there are some types of rights that are more contested for LGBTQ plus people than they are for straight or heterosexual people. So the right to marriage and the right to have a family is a really key one. We've seen across the world and across Europe different kinds of, I guess, contexts and different kinds of shifts in the last number of decades around LGBTQ plus people's right to get married. I'm from Ireland, so I will speak specifically to the Irish context that we had a really high profile referendum in Ireland 10 years ago this year in 2015, that introduced equal marriage, that allowed for lesbian gay couples to get married in Ireland in the same way that others. So there's a piece in there around the right to equal marriage and to marriage equality, and that configures differently in different countries. So you might have countries where LGBT people are able to get married, when countries where LGBT people are able to have like a civil union or maybe a civil partnership, so not quite the same legal standing as a marriage, but somewhere kind of in the middle. And then you might have countries where that's completely banned, not allowed at all. And then there's kind of connected rights in that, in terms of the right to adoption and the right to parentage, the right to have children, and what your kind of legal relationship is with those children as well. So 21 European countries recognize equal marriage and adoption, most of them in Western Europe. There's other pieces there in terms of the right to legal gender recognition. So for transgender people, the right to have your legal name, if you've changed your name, and your legal gender recognized by the state. So, and to have that kind of implemented across like your passport, your IDs, your documents, whatever. Um, and that's a really key piece for a lot of transgender people, is if you are trans and you've transitioned and you've changed your name, and you need to be able to have that kind of recognized on your IDs and on your documents. These are the key kind of hotspot areas in terms of discrimination and hate, and so making sure that nations have protections for LGBTQ plus people in terms of anti-discrimination, um, in work, in terms of access to goods and services, and then protection against hate crime, hate speech, and incitement to hatred, is a very kind of hot topic at the moment. Conversion therapy is also really key. So, in many countries in the world, and including in Europe, it's still completely legal to practice conversion therapy. And conversion therapy is a form of therapy, which I put in quotes because it's not therapy and it's not therapeutic, that tries to change LGBT people. So it tries to make them not gay or make them not trans. And there's only 10 countries in Europe that have a ban on conversion therapy. And then lastly, unfortunately, very contested at the moment, is the right to assembly and association. So the right to gather, the right to form community, the right to to kind of assemble and associate in public. And that is restricted or under attack in 13 countries in Europe. Most notably, very recently, maybe 2 weeks ago, Hungary banned Budapest LGBTQ plus Pride. So it said that the Pride could not happen this year in Budapest, which is a complete attack on anybody's right to assembly, and to assembly and to associate publicly, but specifically obviously for LGBTQ plus people, because healthcare is a really important area, I guess, for the LGBTQ plus community. We often have really specific healthcare needs that are different to the healthcare needs of the non-LGBTQ plus community. One of the key kind of issues for our communities in terms of equal access to healthcare. So LGBTQ plus people report really high rates of negative experiences in healthcare, where doctors and nurses or other healthcare staff are not trained or aware of LGBTQ plus people or health needs. And so if you go to, as an LGBTQ plus person, to hospital or to your general practitioner for any type of healthcare, there can be a real variety or a range, I guess, in terms of the responses there. So if you are trying to access healthcare that is not to do with you being LGBTQ plus, for instance, if you just broke your arm in an accident and you go to hospital, as part of your medical intake, it might come out that you are gay or you're bisexual or you're trans, or lesbian, of course. Um, and then that sometimes can lead to negative interactions with your healthcare providers, even though it's nothing to do with the fact that you broke your arm. Or if you're trying to access a type of healthcare that is specific to you being LGBTQ plus, for instance, through sexual health or mental health, or trans-related healthcare, and there can be huge barriers for people in terms of accessing that kind of care. So the mental health piece is really crucial for us at the moment. Our community reports really elevated rates of anxiety, the depression, self-harm, and suicidality due to all of the things that were on the previous slide. So due to kind of minority stress, the experience of being marginalized, the experience of being discriminated against, of not being able to get married, of pride being banned, of not being able to have your legal gender recognized by the state, having to kind of advocate for yourself and for your rights all the time has a huge mental health impact for our community. And often the mental health services are not trained or adequately resourced to meet those needs because the workers don't know enough or they're not able to. And then there's specific other types of healthcare. So trans healthcare or like gender affirming healthcare is also really key for our community at the moment. And when we say trans healthcare, we mean types of healthcare that trans people specifically might need or want, which is access to hormone replacement therapy, access to gender affirming surgeries. So both of those are things that allow trans people to more outwardly live as the gender that they identify as, and to um, to exist more happily and healthily in themselves and more safely in the world. And there's a huge kind of issues in terms of how people are able to access that type of care. It is often still treated as part of a psychiatric issue and part of a psychiatric disorder, even though 5 or 6 years ago, the World Health Organization kind of declared that any of this type of healthcare is no longer anything to do with a psychiatric issue. It's just part of normal sexual health. That hasn't really been implemented in lots of countries around Europe, including in Ireland. So it's really difficult to access that kind of care in many countries. So this map is a similar project that is carried out by Transgender Europe, which is the European Trans Organization. And this ranks the EU member states in terms of their access to trans healthcare. So Spain and Malta come in really high, and then the kind of the rest of Western Europe, and then kind of the rest of Eastern Europe, and then Ireland came absolutely last. This was in 2022. And they've released this map again since, but nothing's really changed. So there's huge issues in terms of access to trans healthcare. And again, that map is available, and all of the various resources are available on the TGEU website if you want to have a look after this. And you can kind of click into each of the countries and see what the different indicators were and how that research was carried out. And then we can look at social inclusion, and we can look at homophobia and transphobia and how people are included or accepted kind of within society. So I think it's fair to say that in the last couple of decades, Europe has made really significant progress towards LGBTQ plus equality. We've had really high profile wins in terms of marriage equality, in terms of the right to adoption and to have children, in terms of legal gender recognition. Um, in the last maybe 30 or 40 years. But then there's been an increase in the last maybe 5 or 10 years in anti-LGBTQ plus discourse and rhetoric online and in politics as well. So the way that we see that kind of coming up in terms of our social and political discourse is a huge focus on trans people and on LGBTQ plus young people at the moment, and that's kind of playing out online in kind of hate speech online, in attacks on libraries, on schools, on youth groups, on Pride, for instance, as well, places that are supporting LGBT people or where LGBT people meet. We've seen that in terms of restrictions on rights and equality, like the kind of rolling back in terms of our legal rights. And then a lot of the political discourse and the political rhetoric that's coming out of the United Kingdom, that's coming out of the United States, that's coming out of Russia and Hungary and Turkey and like loads of different countries around the world. And I think it's really useful when we look at the anti-LGBT discourse to say that it is coming in different ways, but in some similar ways from countries like the UK and the US and like Russia that would consider themselves to be very politically opposed, but that are aligned in terms of this space, and that does huge harm to our community worldwide. But then also we might see that interpersonally as well. So it doesn't just exist kind of in the social sphere. It is something that LGBTQ plus people are experiencing day to day, and that I kind of think of that on a kind of scale of intensity. So like intentionally or maybe continuously using the wrong name for a trans person, if you know they have changed their name and you're continuing to call them by their old name, or use the wrong pronouns for a trans person, or generally not treat people with like dignity, and kind of verbal harassment, like name calling, certain types of language, certain types of slurs, are all things that trans and LGBTQ plus people would experience. Discrimination in any of the places that you might experience discrimination, so like employment or housing or healthcare, access to services, again reported at really high rates for our communities. and physical and sexual violence at kind of the most extreme end. And again, there's loads of pieces of research on a European level that are kind of collected by ILGA Europe, that the organization that do the rainbow map. So again, there's loads out there. I took like little snapshots for this session, but there's loads out there that I would recommend looking at. And the most common context that people are likely to experience this for trans people are in gendered bathrooms, so in men or women's bathrooms, or like changing rooms, or kind of gendered spaces, or gender segregated spaces. And then the second most common for anybody else is street harassment, so in public, out in public, and that you're likely to be harassed verbally or physically by other people. And I just think it's really important for us to be aware of what's going on for our communities, and that that's not always experienced in the same way by everybody. So there's huge intersectional pieces here for us to understand, that people experience their LGBTQ plus identity differently, and they are received differently by other people depending on their other identities that they might have. So, for instance, in terms of safety and from violence, LGBTQ plus people of color, LGBTQ plus migrants, LGBTQ plus young people, and trans women specifically are all at really high rates and much higher rates of violence and harassment than other LGBTQ plus people. So it's not experienced the same way by everybody, and people will have very different um, experiences, I guess, of being safe or not safe, and depending on whether they are also a migrant, whether they are also from a racialized community, whether they're young, or whether they're particularly for trans women as well, or just expressing femininity, I guess, expressing um, their gender in that way. And then in terms of access and opportunity, so in terms of like access to healthcare, access to employment, access to other kinds of services, there's other kind of questions in there too. So like citizenship is a really big one. And what country are you a citizen of? Where can you access, say something like trans healthcare that's not available maybe in Ireland, but it is available in other countries. And that depends on if you can travel to access that. And the vast majority of Irish transgender people, for instance, are traveling outside of Ireland to access crucial forms of healthcare that they need. And that depends on whether they are an Irish citizen and whether they can travel and access healthcare in Europe, for instance. There's other pieces in there too in terms of disability, neurodivergence, so like autism or ADHD or other forms of neurodiversity, really high rates of that within our community, and that will have a huge impact in terms of how people are able to access employment, in terms of how people are able to advocate for themselves and for their needs, and disabled LGBTQ plus people face really high rates of discrimination from all of those kinds of spaces. And then class and economic status as well. So again, thinking about access to private forms of healthcare, access to housing, access to employment. Again, it's all very different if you are from a wealthy class or from a more privileged socioeconomic class than it is for working class people all across Europe. So it's important for us not to treat the LGBTQ plus community as a monolith, but there are really important differences within that. That means that we all experience our ourselves and our identities differently. And what can we do about this? This piece is around how we can be allies to our community very broadly. We're going to look at the kind of specific types of allyship and the specific types of inclusion that we might build into the classroom in our webinar next month. But this is more broadly around how we can be allies. Um, and I think there's a few different ways that we can think about doing this. And I like to think about it as the different areas in which we can be allies. So there's being an ally in public, so being visible in terms of your support, being verbal in terms of your support, maybe on social media, maybe using like visible kind of visual clues like flags, LGBT flags, like lanyards in work, and badges, like all of that kind of stuff. All the ways that sort of communicate your values without having to speak necessarily, because it can be hard to do that. But the visual cues are really important. You can do things like introduce your pronouns when you're introducing yourself to somebody. You can add them to your email signature or to your social media. You can do fundraising. Like there's loads of public ways of being inclusive that are really important, and especially in the current moment as we're seeing this like social and political backlash against our communities, that it's really important that people are being equally public with their support of the LGBTQ plus community. Being an ally in private, can sometimes be even can be harder. It's around those tricky conversations that you might have with your family or with your friends. I know I've definitely had really tough conversations with family members or with friends, or extended family members maybe around my values and their values and the language maybe that I might hear people using, and how we can kind of interrupt some of that gently and with love and care, challenge some of that. Getting involved in work can be a great thing to do. So like looking at your work area and looking at what it is that you can do, where you can make a change in that space, and in that, like, kind of using your position. So, you know, I don't want to presume necessarily who's on the call, but like if you're a teacher, for instance, in a classroom, that your position there is as a role model to everybody else in the classroom. And again, we're going to look at that in the next webinar. A really important piece is to stay educated. So there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation about the LGBTQ plus community online and in mainstream media at the moment. So on the next slide, I have some resources for like further learning. But there's loads of other ones. Like I picked a few that I really like, but there's loads of other ones. So you could check what people are recommending, and you can check, there's loads of like really good lists and stuff online, and being able to kind of stay informed, to know what the misinformation is, and then being able to respond to that too. So if you're having a really tricky conversation maybe with someone at the dinner table, and they're saying all these things that are untrue, that you're able to kind of respond to that a little bit can be really useful. Be intersectional is really important. So, this whole presentation has been around the LGBTQ plus community, but as I mentioned, LGBTQ plus communities or LGBTQ plus people are also people of color. We are also disabled people. We are also women. We're also part of loads of other minority groups. But then also the work that we do to be allies to the LGBTQ plus community translates also into other communities as well. So as much as I say all of this about being an LGBTQ plus ally, a lot of it's the same for being an ally to people who are racialized, or to migrants or to women or to young people. So it's a lot of it's the same kind of playbook. And then being a barrier from harm, I think, is a really important piece. So being able to interrupt when you hear someone using offensive language or telling a joke that's really rude, and being able to kind of be the person who can have that moment that can be really tricky, especially if it's not something that affects you directly. So if you were someone who's not LGBTQ plus and you hear someone using, say, homophobic language, maybe that might feel really stressful to interrupt that, but it will feel much less stressful for you than it will for someone who's LGBTQ. So being able to kind of be that person in that moment can be really useful. And then there's another piece in terms of like all of the horrible bad news that is out there at the moment, maybe just thinking twice before you share that, even like on social media or with friends. And I know that I have, like, as someone who's working within this space and working specifically within trans rights, that I have friends, I have family members who will often come to me and say like, oh my God, I heard about this horrible thing that happened. I heard about this horrible news story. Did you hear about this law? Did you hear about this thing? And it can be really overwhelming. So, being conscious, I guess, of not doing that too much too. And then lastly, here's some resources if you want some for further learning. These are all kind of specifically for the trans community because that's the kind of context that I'm coming from. But there's a few different ones here that might be useful. So there's a Feminist Present is a podcast. They did a whole series of episodes about trans rights and feminism and how they interact with each other and how they support each other in loads of ways. Disclosure is a documentary on Netflix about trans representation in TV and in film. It's really beautiful. It's really moving. And then the other two are books. So None of the Above is a memoir from someone who is non-binary. Um, it's really wonderful. As someone who is non-binary, it's, I think, the best representation I've seen of my experiences or how I also experience being non-binary. And then the transgender issue is a book about trans rights in the UK, but like it's relevant for loads of other countries. It's relevant, I guess, all across Europe, and it kind of talks, or it's the most closely aligned with what I've been saying today in terms of like legislation, in terms of like transphobia, in terms of access to healthcare, and then loads of other things obviously that we just have to talk about today too. Great. That's the end of my piece. I'm gonna say thank you